Hi, I'm Jeff Rains, the pastor of First Baptist Church Shreveport. I'm so glad you're listening today to the First Baptist Podcast. We worship every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. at 543 Ockley Drive in Shreveport. There is always a place for you. Today, I'd like us to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're at a pivot point in the book of 1 Corinthians. We're working through that this summer. And we've talked about how Paul started this church. He planted it. He lived there for 18 months. He knows them very, very well. But in the time since he's gone, other teachers have come through and kind of given a little different message, and they're dividing up behind these other teachers. And like every church everywhere, they're wrestling with their culture. With blending in with the cultural trends versus following Christ. And so in the opening chapters, Paul is really laying down the law. He says, I've heard from Chloe's people. So some folks have come through and they've come to Paul and they've given a report on this church. And the report is not great. And so in these opening chapters, he talks about the division that they've experienced. They need to cut that out. In chapter 5, there's a really serious case of immorality they've been overlooking. He said it's worse than what's going on among the Gentiles, and so they need to fix this. In chapter 6, very practical things. He says don't sue each other, and prostitution is not acceptable. Paul uses a great theological image at the end of chapter 6. He says, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own, for you have been bought for a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. But here's the shift in the letter as we go to chapter 7. And there are, to this point, he's been laying down the law. These things are incompatible with following Jesus. You need to fix them now. In chapter 7, he starts addressing some issues that they have raised in a letter that they wrote to him. And so this chapter starts with, now concerning the things about which you wrote. And in the coming chapters, he'll say, now concerning this, or now concerning that. And so he's answering their questions. And in this section, Paul is less definitive. These are areas where they're struggling to work out what's the best way to follow this new life in Christ, and Paul's guiding them. And this is so early in the Christian movement. They don't have the New Testament at this point. And so they're trying to figure things out. And so chapter 7, they're trying to understand how belonging to Christ, how does that affect our marriage, sexuality, divorce, singleness? Their culture had one set of assumptions for all those things, but the gospel was teaching them something different. And Paul's answer to this is not just a set of rules of do this, don't do that, but instead he says whether we are married, whether we're single, our bodies, our relationships belong to Christ. And the question is, how can we honor Christ no matter what our relationship situation is? And this is very relevant to us. We struggle with these areas still. Marriage is in decline in our nation. And of course, divorce is still a huge factor in so many lives. And I'll say at the outset that sometimes it is necessary. Paul addresses some of those cases in this chapter, but it's always difficult and always painful. I'd like to go to C.S. Lewis's comment that divorce is more like losing a limb than dissolving a contract. But for those of you who are married, I'd like you to think about something, and it may not take a great stretch of your imagination, but I want us to imagine a marriage relationship expressed by husband and wife really competing and striving to serve each other better and more fully through attentiveness and tenderness and encouragement that marks our days. And in the midst of important topics and hard discussions, a marriage that holds open the possibilities that I may be wrong and quick to apologize and ready to forgive. And I want you to imagine a relationship where resentment isn't allowed to build up a sclerosis style to the arteries of our hearts, but mercy flows freely. And our sexuality is expressed and honored and not warped and tainted by a pornographic culture in which a husband and wife don't just cohabitate or coexist, but co-elevate each other and call out our very best, in which old wounds are understood and healed and different needs honored. And instead of checking out or zoning out or tuning out or cold shoulders, we lean in and chip in and listen in, and there's a warm embrace. And imagine a marriage where each is ready to jump in when the other reaches their end, like relay runners passing the baton. But then also like a tandem bike where we're pedaling together, staying close, pursuing the goal. Imagine a marriage of mutual submission and mutual sacrifice and mutual service, where we serve each other better because our eyes are on Christ together. Can you see that? And can you touch that? Or is it in the distance like a mirage? Does it seem heavenly? Well, the thing about heavenly stuff is Jesus tells us to be bold and audacious, not just to wait for heaven, but to pray now, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So is there a gap between that kind of vision and your reality? And why is that gap there? Is it a matter of pride? Is there kind of a cold war running in your relationship and you don't want to lay down your defenses? Or is it because of laziness? It's just too much work, too much effort. Is it because of brokenness in your life? You struggle mightily to trust or love or to believe that you're lovable. Or maybe you're just trying to maximize what you get out of the relationship, the most personal benefit with the least effort. Or maybe you're too exhausted between work and shuttling and soccer games and obligations and all of the yeses that you've tossed around, that what you end up saying is no to your spouse. So the subtext is you are not as important as this travel team or this tennis match or this work assignment or this LSU game. So how do we close that gap? Let's look at what Paul says in responding to their questions about marriage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So look at verse 1. Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband, and the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise wife to husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say by way of concession, not of command. Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each has his own gift from God, one in this way and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to widows, it's good for them if they remain even as I, but if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife is not to leave her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled. And that the husband is not to divorce his wife, but to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has an unbelieving wife, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if any woman has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not divorce her husband. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet if the unbelieving one is leaving, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this way let him walk. And so I direct in all the churches. It's clear as we read through this chapter that some of their questions about marriage and about these areas are very different from the hot topics today in our culture and some of the questions that we ask. And so we kind of have to struggle and work with interpretation and application here and drawing conclusions for us. And there's been a lot of confusion about verse 1 right off the bat with this statement, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. I've never actually heard this verse quoted as anyone's favorite verse, and some people have criticized Paul for saying such a thing, but what Paul is doing is quoting their letter. They wrote him a letter and gave this sentence, and they were asking him, is this right? And this was a common philosophical idea in that day. And it's interesting because he's already had to address immorality and some other stuff going on in the church, but then there's others in the church, and they're raising the question, well, is human intimacy, is that a thing for the past that doesn't fit with the new age in Christ? So Paul is correcting that idea. And the first point I think we can draw from what he says about marriage and applying to our lives is that we honor Christ by staying connected in marriage rather than allowing ourselves to drift apart. So he brings up physical intimacy, which is certainly an issue today, but then also we need to stay connected with our spouse physically, emotionally, and with being present with them. Our culture is actually, in looking at statistics, in a kind of intimacy recession. And there's a number of suggestions for why that is. We're busier than ever, and families are dual income and racing from activity to activity and exhausted at the end of the day. Another culprit for so many of the major changes in our social life in the last decade is our phones and social media, too, that even as we talk about all the dangers for our children and teenagers with phones and social media, and there's a huge rise in anxiety disorders and other problems for them. But as adults, we're not immune either. And how often do you see couples together at a restaurant, each is just pecking away at their phone? They're together, but not really present and together. And at home, it can be the same with each of us on devices, each of us with headphones, present but not connected, digitally separated. And husbands and wives are in some cases settling for the emptiness of pornography rather than actual human connection. And so we need to stay connected. Before Darcy and I were married, we read a book together called Severe Mercy by Sheldon Van Auken. And there's some great insights in that book about marriage and some concepts we've really carried through. We've talked about them for 31 years. And one of the ideas in that book is that couples have to be very intentional in resisting a creeping separateness in their lives. And maybe you've seen that happen, or maybe you've felt that happen in your own life, that slowly over the years and over even decades that we can grow apart and have different interests and different friends and different media and time spent apart going in different directions. And we wake up one day realizing, well, I'm sharing a room with a stranger. Paul is clear here that our physical connection needs to stay strong in marriage. We need to stay connected emotionally and spiritually and in every way here. And abandoning that connection to scroll social media or to watch Netflix is a very empty exchange. A second thing that really stood out to me in reading through this passage is that we honor Christ through mutual service and mutual love. And I think this is a place where people have badly misread Paul. And I've heard people say that, oh, the Apostle Paul is opposed to women, trying to keep women in their place, trying to preserve a male-dominated home and church and society. And we come to verses like verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And we can read that and decide, oh, Paul is just offensive and irrelevant. And we do have to be very careful with that language because it's been used in abusive ways. Paul is describing mutual self-giving here, not entitlement or coercion. But what I want you to see is how radical it is what Paul says. So when he says, the wife does not have authority over her body, her husband does, he's really just describing how the Roman world was. Like he could have gone to the Corinthian church, he could have gone to the Corinthian marketplace, he could have gone to the Roman Senate and said that sentence, and people would have shrugged and said, well, thank you, Captain Obvious. That's how the world is. But Paul doesn't stop there. He goes on to describe the mirror image of that statement. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Now, that is a shockingly radical statement in the first century. If he went out into the marketplace of Corinth, or if he went into the Roman Senate and said that sentence, people would think he was crazy or dangerous or a threat to society and good order. Nobody said that. We find that really the same kind of thing expressed in Ephesians 5. When Paul comes to marriage, he starts out his discussion by saying, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So the idea of male domination was not something that Paul discovered and brought into the world, but that's the way the Roman world operated. And any Christian husbands today who only read half of what Paul says here and expect their wives to function like children or like servants, obeying or just meeting their needs, that is not an expression of Christian faith. That's an expression of pagan Rome. But what Christianity brought was something radically new, was this idea of mutuality, of belonging to one another, of self-giving here. When Paul describes how Christian husbands should treat their wives in Ephesians 5, the model he gives is Christ and the church. Well, Jesus washed the disciples' feet. He died for them. It's a life of giving and service and love that we offer to one another mutually in marriage. Respect for one another, a partnership of listening to one another and caring for one another above yourself. Now, I know the title of the sermon was about marriage. That was the heading in verse 1. But something that emerges very clearly that I don't want us to miss in this chapter is the value and the benefit and beauty of singleness. All through this chapter, when Paul's talking about marriage, when he's talking about people who are engaged, when he's talking about widows or widowers, he makes comments like this verse, I wish that all of you were as I am. So what is he saying there? He's single. He's saying, he goes on, each of you has a gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. And Paul sees his singleness as a gift. And in church, we have not always honored this part of the New Testament. It's a clear New Testament teaching. But sadly, in church sometimes, we have treated single people as second-class citizens. But this passage is abundantly clear that there's a gift to singleness. The reason is down in verse 35. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you might live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. Paul sees his singleness as a gift and a benefit for his ministry as he travels, as he's on the road, as he's getting arrested and thrown in jail, and all the things that he goes through for the gospel, that his focus is able to be on Christ. And that brings us to, I think, the most important point of this chapter. The chapter started with a question about asceticism, about denying the body. But the principle that Paul ends up holding up all through this chapter is that for every one of us, whether we are married, whether we are single, whether we are engaged or widow or widower, the point is for us to honor Christ with our lives. That's the focus of this chapter. Our world gets this so reversed. Our world kind of worships the fulfillment of desires, and people build their whole identities on it. That's the wrong approach for us as believers. It's not about pursuing every desire. It's about honoring Christ with our bodies, with our relationships, with our marriages, or in our singleness, in all of it. And when our focus is on honoring Christ, all those other aspects of our life get better. In a relationship, of course, it can get better on our side. There's no guarantee for the other person in this relationship. Paul addresses the situation where only one spouse is following Christ in a marriage. And in that case, you do your best to follow Jesus, embody Christ, imitate Christ, serve your spouse the best that you can. Allow the fruit of the Spirit to grow in your life and ask God to work in that situation. So in closing, what I want you to think about is this. Does this part of your life belong to Christ? Does your marriage belong to Jesus? Or has it been surrendered to busyness or resentment or distraction or control or neglect? Or does your singleness, does that belong to Jesus? Or have you begun to believe that your life is incomplete until someone else is there? Does your sexuality belong to Christ, or is it being formed more by our culture than by the love of Christ? And what are the next steps for us for this week? Maybe for some married couples, the next step is to turn toward one another this week, to put the phone down, to ask a real question, to listen, and not be trying to defend yourself, or maybe offer that apology that you've put off. Maybe it's pray together, even if it's awkward and brief. For some, maybe the next step is not just a private promise to work harder if you're struggling in these issues, but to ask for help and to speak to our staff or a counselor or a Christian friend. Or if you're single, ask how God can use your freedom, your relationships, your gift, your attention and devotion for His kingdom. And for all of us, if there is a place in our lives where Christ is not at the center, can we take a step of obedience this week? Because the goal of life is not merely to have a happier marriage, it's not to find a spouse, not to avoid failure, but the goal is that in our bodies and in our relationships and in our marriage and singleness, that Jesus Christ would be honored. You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God with your body. Thank you for listening today to the First Baptist Shreveport podcast. You can learn more about our church and watch the services at firstbaptistshreveport.org.